You are listening to the Visualising War podcast. In each episode, we talk about representations of war in art, text, film, and music. With new guests each time, we look at how people have described or imagined war in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which war stories have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Konig, and I co-direct the Visualising War project at the University of St Andrews. My guests today are artist Jill Calder, author James Robertson, and illustrator Jim Hutcheson, who's also creative director at the Scottish publishing company Berlin Books. All three are very well known in their own right, but they've come together today to talk about a book they created together, an illustrated history of Robert the Bruce, published in 2014. We're going to use that book to talk about representations of war in children's literature more generally, something which the Visualising War project is really keen to look closely at, because the stories we're told and the pictures that are painted for us as children have a really profound impact on how we understand and imagine conflict for the rest of our lives. So Jill, James, and Jim, thank you very much for sparing the time to talk to me today, and welcome to the Visualising War podcast.
Hello. Hello.
So Jim, I wonder if we can start with you and how you came to bring the Robert the Bruce story to life through illustration and storytelling yourselves, and how you imagined it, what you wanted to achieve with the story of Robert the Bruce, and what kind of brief you gave Jill and James when you brought them in on the project.
I've always loved the story of Bruce, and I thought that'd be great. And then I was thinking it'd be nice if this became popular, we could do some other familiar characters. And I thought Jill and I had worked together before, and I just thought she'd be perfect for it, you know. So we started meeting up for coffee, and I put together a kind of, I suppose what you'd call a style sheet with lots of medieval imagery. I was interested in was Disney's Sleeping Beauty. One of the best paid Disney illustrators did Sleeping Beauty, and a lot of the background scenes are based on Renaissance, Italian Renaissance paintings, if you look at it that way. But very, very evocative of the medieval period. So Jill and I were talking about that, etc., and how we would get a different image of Bruce, and also being aware that it was only going to be 64 pages, and 4 of them were going to entail a full-pitched medieval battle across the double-page spread. You know, so all these wee technical issues were brought to the fore. Jill, I don't think you knew the story that as well when we kicked off. And
no, I didn't. I remember us having many coffees and, you know, chatting about this. My initial reaction to this was, I don't know anything about Robert the Bruce. I mean, I managed to go to school in Scotland and, you know, study all the way up to history, higher exam. And we weren't taught any Scottish history at all in the school I went to. So I felt very ignorant about that story. I mean, I knew the basics. Battle of Bannockburn, wasn't quite sure when it was. You know, everything else was pretty hazy. So I thought, I don't know if I'm the right person to illustrate this book. But Jim is very persuasive and persistent. It kind of coincided with the time when I was finishing teaching at Edinburgh College of Art, and I thought, well, I need a new challenge. It was to kind of get stuck in and start researching and learning about this story. And of course, that, you know, when James came in as writer, I mean, that completely illuminated everything. And I remember having, you know, several meetings where it was you were both telling me about, you know, these aspects of Robert the Bruce's life and the things that happened. And I think that more than anything was what really drew me in and kind of got me thinking about different ways I could illustrate this story.
James, you had a big hand in shaping which bits of Robert the Bruce's story you wanted to pull out.
Well, it's interesting because I grew up in Bridge of Allen, which is a stone's throw away from the Wallace Monument and just a few miles away from Bannockburn. So I kind of knew the basics of the stories around that whole period reasonably well as a child. But when this commission came up, I had to go back and really reread and remember the story of Robert the Bruce, Robert I of Scotland, as I remembered it from my childhood, is a really funny mixture of history and folklore and mythology. You know, there's the story of Bruce and the Spider, which I think I'm right in saying the first written down account of that comes from Walter Scott in the 1820s. before that, it's an oral tradition, but he's the first one that actually writes that story down. And of course, now it's the one thing that nearly everybody knows about Robert the Bruce is that he had this encounter with a spider. And the other thing we know is that he went back after seeing the spider, finally make its web, that he went back out again, fought loads of battles and ended up winning the Battle of Bannockburn. For me, the way to try and get this across was to find a sort of a narrative that took us through the mythology and the folklore, but also gave so that there was a good story, but also gave the young readers that we were aiming the book at a sense when they had finished reading it that they had actually learned something as well, but not in a kind of finger wagging way, but that they'd actually, when they'd finished it, it would sit on their shelves and hopefully they might take it down again, knowing actually because of that book, I now know a great deal about that period of Scottish history that I didn't know before. So for me, that was one of the principal aims. And of course, the book came out in 2014, which was the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn. So it was a fortuitous year to do that. And coincidentally, it happened to be also the year of the referendum on Scottish independence. So there were all kinds of reasons why it was a good year for this book to come out. And to try and place the story of Bruce in that kind of context, I thought was also important. But without trying to make a modern political point, I wanted to tell the story of what was going on in the early 1300s in order perhaps for people to understand why we were still talking about Scottish independence 700 years later.
I think that's very interesting because here you are wrestling with the fine line you tread between mythology and, authentic history, recreating and explaining a period and a person whose story continues to influence Scottish politics and Scottish identity and so on today. Robert the Bruce is a famous warrior, led the first war of Scottish independence against England, famous for all sorts of battles, not just the Battle of Bannockburn. How did you decide you wanted to tell the story of those battles? Which bits of battle, which aspects of war, which aspects of being a warrior did you want to bring out in your storytelling? And if you'd like, you can perhaps illustrate that by maybe reading one or two bits.
The kind of cumulative set piece bit of violence in the story is the Battle of Bannockburn, which takes place over 3 days in June 1314. And so I think when the three of us, Jim and Jill and myself, were sitting there working out, that this was a 64-page book, that we only had a certain amount of space, that the text actually had to be not very long because we had to leave more space really for the illustrations than for the text. So we didn't have a lot of time or space. And so I think I'm just looking the book up now, but I think I'm right in saying that the Battle of Bannockburn takes up 4 double-page spreads in the book. That's already 8 of your 64 pages gone. So that was the kind of cumulative bit of violence. But I wanted, for me, although that's absolutely crucial to the telling of the story, I wanted to make sure that that any reader could see the route by which the story gets to that point. That's the big deal. And after that, basically, the independence hasn't been completely won for Scotland, but we know that that's what the outcome of this story is going to be. So before we get to that, of course, there are lots of ups and downs, and there are some really very violent episodes. So I'm going to read you one of those first, which is just describing some of the tactics employed by the Scots when they're still really struggling to get the English occupying forces out of Scotland. And this is a story about one of Bruce's chief military colleagues, Sir James Douglas, and what happens when he goes to recapture his own castle of Castle Douglas in Lanarkshire, which was occupied by the English. Sir James Douglas secretly assembled a group of local men, and on Palm Sunday, when the garrison marched to church, Douglas's men mingled with them, then drew concealed weapons and overwhelmed them. So complacent were the occupiers that they had left the castle gates open and unguarded. Douglas and his men seized the castle, closed the gates, and ate their fill of the huge dinner that had been prepared. Then, having removed as much plunder as they could carry, they made an enormous pyre of the remaining stores, beheaded their captives, threw their bodies on top, and set the castle ablaze. This gruesome event became notorious as the Douglas Ladder. we can come back and talk about how Jill illustrates that later, but I thought that was really important to get in at least one episode like that, just to demonstrate, that the violence was being perpetrated on both sides of this conflict, and it was pretty horrible, but also just to say that the big set piece of Bannockburn is preceded by a long, long period of really awful, horrible stuff going on. And I think part of the reason I wanted that to be in there was because I thought that that might then connect in the minds of the readers with the sort of thing that they were probably seeing bits of on the television and the internet in terms of the wars that are going on today. You know, we see these terrible, terrible conflicts going on today, and atrocities that are committed in these wars are not so dissimilar to what was happening in Scotland 700 years ago. And I thought that was a really important point to make.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So maybe we could ask Jill to talk us through a little bit how she chose to illustrate Douglas Larder story, which, as James said, is written in a way where he really wants people to connect modern and 14th century atrocity. That's the word you used, and this sort of sense that we're looking at not just the lead up, not just sort of tit for tat, but really brutal crimes, effectively.
Yeah, it's a very brutal scene, and when I came to reflect upon it and how I was going to illustrate it, I thought, well, these days it would be considered a war crime, what happened, I think. So again, I mean, maybe this ties back to my looking at the Encyclopedia Britannica and old Mary Queen of Scots getting her head chopped off. But that seemed a scene I couldn't shy away from as an illustrator. Yes, this is a children's picture book, for slightly older children, maybe that kind of age 9+, One of the things I wanted to do here was show the heads, but they're slightly hidden by flames coming up and bits of half-eaten chicken and, toppled over wine flagons and things like that scattered on the floor of this castle too. So maybe you don't see them immediately. And my reference for this, which is a rather grim place I had to go on the internet, was I decided that I needed to get proper reference for this. And I think it's maybe still ongoing, but at the time there was a lot of conflict in Mexico and South America with the drug cartels and these kind of awful, quite theatrical, if you like, acts of retribution and punishment with anybody that was caught grassing up or speaking to the police or doing anything. Anything. And people were often caught, tortured, and then beheaded, or limbs and everything, and then displayed. These kind of bodies were displayed on the side of the street. And so you kind of Google that and you come up with these horrific images. But that was my source for drawing this image, which sounds horrific when you say it's a children's book, but actually it needed to be convincing, I felt. And as James says, these things are still happening today in conflicts around the world, whether it's an actual war or whether it's it's between drug cartels or whatever.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because obviously, we've got lots and lots of images from, the medieval period and later that do give us images of beheading, but you've chosen actually to go for kind of modern, as your source, as your inspiration, some modern day realism, perhaps to give your pictures that grit that might help people make the connection that James said he wanted people to make.
I mean, Jill, you got the balance just right there, because it is storytelling. It's got the balance between a form of reality and attractiveness, actually, dare I say. It's a colourful image, predominantly red, but it's the story itself and Douglas committing the act, etc. I think they were conscious of the activity being told and relayed to other folks. So I think using the word theatrical is absolutely right, and that's an aspect of illustration which can be brought in and added to a story. Whereas if it was just totally explicit, it would lose that power, actually.
I would agree with that. I think it's Jill's illustrations throughout this book are astonishing, but that particular page is so beautifully done. And Jim's right, it's a very beautiful image. And then you look more closely and you realize it's not quite so beautiful what's going on there. And the fact that the heads, you kind of have to look for them through the flames. but once you see them, you can't unsee them. Again, I think, I would like to think that a child, a young reader who has this book and sees that image is going to stick. And I think that's a good thing. I know that if I had had this book when I was 10 years old, I would have been absolutely fascinated by the story and the image as it is. And I would have gone back and back to it. I had a kind of fascination, but I would have been absorbing, what does that mean? What is that about? In the same way that, and again, maybe this is slightly a tangent, but I remember being fascinated when I first saw, again, about that age, a reproduction of Hieronymus Bosch's big painting, The Triumph of Death, with all these skeletons and devils taking people off. I think it looks a little bit like what Jill's got here, but it also that tied in with the first time I ever saw pictures of the liberation of Auschwitz and the sort of the awfulness of the concentration camps when they were discovered, the death camps. And so all of these things are connected in my head as a child and as an adult. And what I think was really important in this book, which Jill does so beautifully, is to try and depict that stuff so that it sticks in the head of the reader.
Yeah, I mean, Jill, you said it was your first children's book, but I think, the way you've explained that shows that you really understand how children read. I've got children myself, and I know how much they do pore over the illustrations. And I was struck when you were talking about your memories of your sort of childhood exposure to war stories, that many of you focused on the illustrations and the visuals, even more perhaps than the storytelling. And absolutely, one of the things that some of our other podcast guests have talked about is artists and photographers using beauty and the charm of a picture to draw adult as well as children's readers and viewers in, and then people can peel away the layers themselves. And as you say, if you do that kind of active reading and active viewing and active looking, then the ideas and the impact really sticks. I should just at this point, I think, say that obviously listeners can buy the Robert the Bruce book at any good bookshop, and they should absolutely go ahead and do that because it's an amazing book. But also Jill is kindly going to share with us one or two images which will pop on the Visualising War website in a blog piece. People can have a good look at, for example, the Douglas Larder page. Shall we take a look now at how you told the story, James, of the Battle of Bannockburn itself, and then we'll look at how that was illustrated too. So perhaps you can talk us through what you wanted to bring out when you were narrating the Battle of Bannockburn, having led up to it with all these incidents of violence on both sides, the build-up, and then these 4 pages on the battle, the most famous battle itself.
One of the things that I wanted to show to the first place that Robert the Bruce probably wouldn't have chosen to fight the Battle of Bannockburn if it hadn't been kind of bounced into it by his brother Edward, who had kind of made a pact with the English garrison who were holding on to Stirling Castle. It was really the last castle that the English still had in Scotland. I think there were 1 or 2 others, but basically Edward Bruce rather unwisely said to the governor of Stirling Castle, made a deal with him that he would surrender the castle if it hadn't been relieved by an English force by midsummer, in fact, the following year. And Robert Bruce was pretty annoyed with his brother for doing this, because his campaigns had been successful because he had avoided set pitched battles with the English army, which was much stronger and more superior than his own forces. So he was kind of bounced into having to come to Stirling to fight this battle. So that was the first thing. So he needed to try and get as much advantage as he could out of the terrain, and by being there before the very large English army under Edward II came north. So so I wanted to build in the preparations, how they prepare the ground. They dig little holes, pots as they were called, so that the English cavalry will be tripped up as they come forward. And they had wee spiky things that they scattered on the ground called caltrops, which again would hurt the horses' legs and feet as they were riding, and would make them fall over. And if you came off your horse in full armour, you were in deep trouble, because you weren't necessarily going to be able to get back to your feet before somebody came along and stuck a spear in you. So all of that stuff, the preparation that went on to basically try and redress, to make it more of an even playing field for the Scots than it would otherwise have been, was important. And then the battle itself takes place, and it was important to try and set up the numbers of men on both sides and where they were and how many horses each side had and so on and so forth. And so that took a bit of setting out. There's a big double-page spread where you can see all the army gathering on both sides. She actually handwrites in things like fewer than 10,000 men, Welsh and Irish archers on the English side. And she's kind of put a map in there so you can see where some of the key places are as well. And that was, I think, a very important page, just people to get a sense of what was about to happen. And then the battle itself takes place. As I say, there's quite a lot of text in there to describe what happens in the battle. But it's not all about the fighting. It's also about what Bruce says to his men before the battle takes place. That, to me, was a really important point at which to remind people in the story what this was about, that fundamentally Robert Bruce was trying to assert his right to be King of Scots. But most of the people who were there with him were also there to assert their right not to be dominated by English rule. And the speech that Bruce makes at that point is really quite important for reminding people why this conflict has been going on for all that time. So yeah, there were quite a lot of things to pack into the telling of the story of Bannockburn.
Yeah, lots of things to pack in. It sounds like you were interested not just in telling the story from Robert the Bruce's perspective, but absolutely giving readers a flavour of what it might have been like, or what might have been motivating the sort of the individual people taking part. Were you interested in conveying a kind of sense of fear, a sense of what was at stake for them, the potential cost of failure?
Yes, I was, very much so. Again, it's interesting how what Jill and I and Jim came up with in this book. It's not what I would describe as a factual history book. Yes, there's lots of facts in it, but it's not the place I would go to if I was saying, right, read a history of Robert the Bruce. This is a narrative that tells that story, but it utilizes some of the folklore and mythology around it, and I think a way that doesn't traduce the real story. But for example, after Bruce has given this speech to his men saying, this is about freedom rather than about wealth and all the rest of it, and they all get down on their knees and pray. And this is, again, one of the sort of myths around the story, which may or may not be true, but it's certainly come down to us. And Edward II sees them pray and he says, they kneel for mercy. And one of Edward's knights answered, yes, but not from you, from God for their sins. These men will win all or die. I think that gets across that this was an age of very intense religious belief, but also that these are ordinary people who are prepared to actually say, this is it. If we don't win this, we're in big trouble. Prepared to stay and fight. And I think that's there's a certain heroism in ordinary folk in the army of Bruce there, which is not perhaps on the same scale as his story, but it's absolutely crucial to his story.
Jill, can you talk us through how you decided you then wanted to illustrate these 4 pages? And one of the things that strikes me when I look at it is that, yes, you're illustrating the people, and we get sight of lots of people. We get sight of Robert the Bruce in particular at times. We also get to look into the horse's eyes on 1 or 2 occasions, and I rather love that. And so we might come onto those horse's eyes in one particular picture in a minute, but perhaps you can just tell us, first of all, more generally, what did you particularly want to bring out that was going to complement James's text and continue to tell this story that is a story that's got history in it, but that is sort of getting to the essence of what it might have been like for ordinary people as well as Robert the Bruce to fight this huge battle where the stakes were so high?
Well, first of all, I think we've got these 4 spreads about the Battle of Bannockburn, and which is not a huge amount considering it's the kind of key battle in the history of Robert the Bruce, basically. So I remember these particular spreads were the ones that Jim and I, him as my creative director on the book, had the most discussion about how to use those pages effectively, the flow of the image from page to page, thinking about, what we call in picture book parlance, the page turn, what you could do with those 4 pages, rather than it just being a scene of battle, page after page after page. James has already mentioned that the first spread in the battle is really a kind of map. I call it, probably rather incorrectly, a kind of infographic, because it's done in a slightly different style, but it shows, you immediately see that the English army is much bigger, and it's colour coded. I used kind of red throughout the book for English, blue for Scottish, and there was all sorts of other muddy colours and things in between. But you can see very clearly this much bigger army. You know, over on the other side of the Bannockburn, on half the page, there is the Scottish army, much smaller, doesn't have heavy cavalry. You know, it's as you know, say fewer than 10,000 men. And where they're lined up, you know, the kind of geographic location. And then you turn the page. And this, to me, this was the one illustration, Jim, I don't know if you remember this. I redid this illustration I've got about 10 or 11 versions of it. For me, I think this ended up being what was the Battle of Bannockburn. It came down to this one moment, basically. But it started off being a really big, almost cinemascope type scene where you saw, you know, Edward II and his army, and there was the woods and the soldier, Bruce's soldiers lined up, and, you know, Bruce on his pony wielding his axe, and this young English knight, Henry de Bohun, deciding to kick things off by charging forward, thinking, I'll have all my glory and I'll kill Robert Bruce and that will be it, you know. We won't have to fight the battle. You know, I'm much younger than him and much fitter. So that was a really difficult scene to get right. And it ended up with this huge horse that the knight Henry de Bohun was on, with all his armour and everything. I mean, must have weighed an absolute ton, kind of charging towards Robert the Bruce, who was a much more experienced military man with great horsemanship on this much smaller horse, who kind of read the situation perfectly and thought, okay, I'm going to let this play out and we'll see what this young chap has up his sleeve. But he knew that the young knight hadn't read the ground, this kind of boggy ground properly, the weight of his armour. And, you know, it just ended up basically with Robert the Bruce kind of pulling his horse to one side and raising this battle axe of his favourite battle axe, and basically whacking it through the head of Henry de Bohun. So we decided, I mean, Jim, I don't know if you want to jump in here, but we ended up this kind of closing in on this exact moment. So it's a real close-up of Alice, as you were saying. I mean, you see Robert the Bruce's face. There was lots of discussions about his facial expression. I remember that, Jim. Henry de Bohun, but also the expressions on the horse's face as they pass close by each other. Their kind of eyes absolutely wide. I mean, you just imagine the adrenaline of that moment, close contact, you know. And it kind of came down to that moment again. Sort of, it's a very different style of illustration to the one on the previous page, but I think they go together, because you're zooming in on a really just one moment in that battle, but which actually was a pretty defining moment in the battle. You know, that did carry on over the next sort of day and night. But yeah, it was important to me to show that kind of the adrenaline and the fear in the horses' faces, even though those horses would be trained for battle, and also to show Robert the Bruce with his teeth gritted as he physically put an axe through another man's head, through that helmet that he would be wearing, and that kind of moment of superiority, really, but also extreme violence as well.
I mean, I think Bruce made an informed decision. He was, apparently, it's an Arab horse maneuver that he used, which he was, as you said, top horseman. I think he was kind of well aware, 99% sure of what would happen, and the morale effect of that engagement really set it up. So to actually, from the beginning of the book all the way through, where you've got various distances from the action, etc., to suddenly hone in as close to that one, and it's just two people which actually in a way decided the outcome there and then. It's great. And then when you turn over the page there, it is extremely violent, and it's not, you're not mincing words there.
This is where design as well as illustration, I think, seems to be so important in a book like this, because that double spread, or the close-up of the two men and the two horses, and there's Jill's mentioned the colour coding throughout the book of blue sort of representing Scotland and red representing England. There's actually a lot of white space on these pages as well, which I think really brings that colour coding out. The bit that always draws me in is the blood splatter, which is, you can't shy away from what that act of violence is doing. It is obviously killing somebody else. And Bruce is already earlier on in the book, he's murdered somebody inside a church. And, it does not shy away from the fact that this story is full of really serious violence. And that illustration is so vivid, it's so powerful.
And I think several things come across. So James, you just said the design of the book is very important. And, across this 4-page spread, but across the whole book as well, you do get the sense you actually learn some truths about war, or at least about battle, about war as well, I think. But you learn about the kind of the pulsing of time. And so that, the first page where all the troops are set up and there's anticipation and build up and the speech, the sort of the building of the stakes. And then this second page in the 4-page spread of the Battle of Bannockburn takes us to quite a decisive quick moment and just helps you see that the course of a battle can change in a flash. And for me, I do think the horses are such a powerful part of this picture, because the horse's eyes have the most sort of emotional intelligence in the picture, almost like a commentary where the horses are explaining, do you know what, this is brutal, this is awful, this is horrendous. And the men are just so caught up in the action because Robert the Bruce's gaze is so focused hard on that helmet and on that act of violence. Jim, did you have any particular guidance or concerns or thoughts about, age appropriateness of either the narrative or the imagery in this book? It's a children's book. Were there things that you thought were off limits? Jill said she looked at Mexican drug cartels to think about images of beheading, not instantly children's book material perhaps, but obviously she then packaged that in a beautiful way.
I mean, the short answer is no. No, I had thoughts, but no, I didn't have any worries because, I've worked with quite a few illustrators over the years and I'm an illustrator myself, but I thought Jill's style of illustration, her approach was absolutely right for this. And even though we just discussed the killing of Behun is very violent, at the same time, it's stylized to such an extent that I don't think it's offensive. Another illustrator could have made an absolute mess of that, but I never had any doubt that Jill, I was going to say, hit the nail on the head, hit the knight on the head.
And it's interesting that you used the word stylized, because I think that's right. There are other scenes where there are sort of arrows flying through the air and then landing in people's faces and blood. Again, stylized, so violent, but stylized. James, did you feel that you were wanting to write in a particular style? Did you want to evoke quite a historic, mythic storytelling style? And does that help depict war in a register that's different from, let's say, the narration of a kind of much more modern conflict?
That's an interesting question. I need to go back and look at all the drafts of the text that I did. Because it was a kind of strange balance of telling a good story, but also trying to get the historical information across to a readership that one had to assume didn't know that much about the story when they started reading the book. It was quite a tricky thing. And my memory is that I wrote a sort of brief summary of what I thought was going to be in the story, which was the first thing that Jill read, which meant that she could then begin to get her head around what scenes and images she might want to include, or what was essential to include. But my memory is that then I went and rewrote quite a lot, and I think Jim was very helpful there as well in saying, because we had to cut the text down quite a lot. I think I'd overwritten, but I think it does it pretty effectively. And can I also say as well that, just in agreement with both what Jill and Jim said, one of the fundamental things I believe about writing, whether it's writing for adults or for children, is that you mustn't second guess how they're going to receive your what you write. You have to give readers the credit for being able to deal with the facts, the stuff that you present to them. You can't sort of flag up, what do they call these things now, sort of warning signals beforehand saying, before you turn this page, you might find the next page a bit frightening because there's somebody getting their head caved in with an axe. I don't believe that that's the right way to write books. And most young readers, I believe, don't want that stuff. They don't want to be told how to read a book. They just want to read a good book.
Well, that brings us neatly on to asking how children and young readers have responded. I know you've done book talks, and so you've actually managed to chat to some of the people who've enjoyed your work. What's their response been? What kinds of things have they picked out that they found particularly interesting or that really grabbed their attention?
I lent the book to a friend who's in the same studio as myself to let his two sons have a read of it because they didn't know about it. They really enjoyed it and were kind of disturbed by the illustration of Bahoon, by the way, slightly contradicting what I said earlier. But the father who was reading the book to them said, I didn't know that about such and such, you know. And so the father had come away. He thought he knew the story of Bruce and he didn't. So, I mean, down to James's artful retelling, you know, that's certainly a successful communication there.
I think that's a really important point, that actually, although this is aimed at young readers, it can also be read by adults who will get quite a lot out of it, I think. And perhaps even more important, it can be read by adults and young readers together. So, you know, that father-son relationship that Jim just described, I think that would work. That's a really good way for this book to be read. I've got a young neighbour just a few houses away who's, I think he's about 11 years old. He's fanatically interested in anything to do with history. So I gave him a copy of this book and he just devoured it because I think was able to assimilate the facts and the figures and the information that was in there, as well as the images, without any difficulty whatsoever. I like that idea that this is a book that can be read by different age groups, either together or one after another.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I think that, you know, the best kind of children's book is one that really stimulates and entertains adults as much as children. It's something that you can read together.
Yes. I mean, James and I, we've done a few events together, and I can, you know, remember some memorable moments where you're maybe told by a festival organizer that, oh no, it's only going to be, we've kind of made sure that, you know, kids of a certain age are coming into this, and you're thinking about the slideshow that you're going to have on the wall and everything. And then, of course, a family troop in with, you know, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, because they're all there at a book festival or a book event together. So I remember us having a few kind of hurried conversations before an event started, going, okay, well, maybe slightly gloss over that bit of violence, and, you know, we'll kind of be mindful of the really young kids in the room. But other events, I think there was one in particular that we did, I think it was at the Edinburgh Book Festival. I remember at the end, we were up signing the books together. There was this lovely, very nice big queue to see of people who all had copies of the book. One mum in particular came up with 2 kids, and they both had a copy of the book, which was very nice to see. Obviously, to, you know, no arguments about sharing or anything. One of the children kind of was so delighted to see us, and they had to tell us that their favourite page in the book was all the heads on the floor. That was the bit they loved. And the mum was just kind of, she was quite a glamorous mother, and she was like, they love that page. They absolutely love that page. And I just remember thinking, that's okay then. That's good if we're getting that kind of reaction. And actually, I mean, I don't know about you, James, but I mean, I've done quite a few school events and now around the book, and, you know, we do various things and we make little mini picture books about Robert the Bruce and all sorts of things. And actually, I've never had any complaints from teachers or parents or anything. Yeah, so I think it's been very well received, and that honesty is very well received.
I found it interesting just then, Jill, that you used the word honesty. And I think this is something that's been coming across as well in what Jim's been saying about the fine line between storytelling and historical accuracy, the honesty of the story. Do you think, whether we're dealing with a children's audience or not, is it easier for us to explore conflict through history than through the contemporary? So would you take a very different approach, for example, if you were writing and illustrating a children's book about, let's say, the Trojan War, you know, a very famous ancient war, compared with, let's say, a children's book about the Israel-Palestinian conflict or the war in Yemen or the conflict in Syria? Would they require very different approaches? Could you take the same approach to them and be equally effective?
I don't know if anybody's seen Joe Sasko's book on Palestine. 12 or maybe even 15 years ago it came out. It would be regarded as a graphic novel, which is something Joe was saying earlier, where you can take a very, very, very complicated situation and actually get the bare bones of the story across in this, what is a relatively new medium, the graphic novel. And there's a few excellent things out there. That book is really worth a look, you know. Whereas if it was photographic, for instance, it would be almost unwatchable. But in order to get the story across, so it's got a fairly simple style of illustration. Whereas when you mention the Trojan War, there's a fantastic edition of that by an illustrator called Alan Lee, and Alan Lee was commissioned by Peter Watkins for Lord of the Rings. So there's the big battle in Lord of the Rings, the Battle of Pelennor Fields, which in the book is just like an account of Agincourt or something like that. You know, it's the film's slightly different, but it's Alan Lee's visuals there. They're beautiful, even though it's carnage that's going on.
So it's an interesting point you make there, that fiction has a really valuable role to play compared with, let's say, stark photography in helping us access even a very modern conflict. You know, look at it in its gory details without looking at the real gory details, as it were. But it's a way in. It's a kind of point of access that helps us understand.
I was thinking about this, and it's not maybe really a conflict, though it has been spoken about in words of, you know, in that kind of description, has been the past year and a half with the pandemic. And that has affected everybody, including children, because their lives have been so disrupted. Some publishers have managed to push out some books for parents really to read with, or for their children to be able to help them process what's been happening and how that has affected their lives. Because, I mean, the only thing I could compare it to, and again, it has been in the language that we've had from government, is this kind of blitz-like spirit of dealing with it, you know, stay at home and, you know, kind of all this kind of thing. I think children, suddenly they were at school one day and the next minute they weren't allowed, and they weren't allowed to see their friends, and they were indoors. And you can compare that really in some ways to the Second World War. I don't know, it's maybe we're still in the middle of it, of course, but I think it will be interesting to see some of the books about that are coming out or have come out, and that maybe are there going to be books about that in 10 years' time, when we've had a chance to, and in much in the same way that, I mean, we were talking about earlier, about there was lots of films and books about the Second World War that came out in the 60s. I think it'll be interesting to see how this period, although not a conflict as such, but how it's captured and kind of portrayed and conveyed to children, I think in maybe, let's say, 10 years' time.
And indeed described by children. So one of the other podcast guests that we've had on is Lady Lucy French, who founded the Never Such Innocence project, which started as a commemoration of World War I, but really going out to children and young people across the UK and now globally, asking them to write poetry, to draw, to create songs and speeches that capture their ideas about conflict. And one of the things that their competition this year has done is allowed people submitting work to use the pandemic as a conflict, and talk about their experiences of the pandemic as much as other conflicts around the world. So yes, it will be really interesting to see how children's publishing responds to this rather extraordinary time that we've gone through, which, as you say, Jill, has sometimes been framed as we're fighting a war against a virus and we've got to kind of harness a sort of wartime spirit almost. Just looking forward then, we've talked a little bit about children's publishing and the representation of war in children's literature, in art and text in the past, your experiences of it growing up, how it might have changed a bit over time. What do you think the future holds in terms of the kinds of conflict that children's publishing might look at, and the aspects of conflict that literature might be focusing on? We've talked about the fact that in the past it has focused very much on soldiers and men, and there hasn't been so much emphasis on women or perhaps on civilians. Might we see more emphasis on mental trauma, on disruption to schooling, migration? One of the things that I've noticed coming through in recent years actually is more books that sow the seeds of peace, or that help children feel like they actually perhaps have a role to play in being peacemakers. So I'm thinking of, for example, The Cello of Mr. O by Jane Cutler. So Michael Forman's A Child's Garden, where a child is kind of caught up in a conflict, but these little seeds keep poking up and they're a sign of peace. What do you see as the trends going forward, the kinds of war that children's publishing might focus on, and the aspects of conflict it might bring out?
I think it's very difficult to predict, because we don't know really what warfare is going to look like, although we have some ideas, and we don't know what effect warfare is going to have on different parts of the population. And one of the things, though, I think is going to have to be addressed is that increasingly the sort of wars that are being fought now are increasingly the destructive missiles, whatever they are, bombs, etc., are being now remotely delivered. They're being delivered by people sitting in offices, sometimes thousands and thousands of miles away from the theatre of war. At that level, a war can look kind of like a video game to the people who are firing the missiles. And, oh, great, we zapped that thing. And they don't actually have to, these people often don't have to go anywhere near the consequences of what they do when they press that button. But we know that the consequences of those buttons being pressed is just as traumatic and ghastly and horrible as, war has been in the past. So I think one of the things we're going to have to address, not just as writers and illustrators and makers of books, but as a society, is that kind of misfit between the way that war is increasingly conducted at a distance and the effects of it on the ground. And you've only got to look at what's going on in Palestine at the moment or in Yemen to see how increasingly you don't have to have soldiers on the ground for there to be absolutely devastating effects on the civilian populations and the places where they're affected. So war is changing in that respect. That doesn't make it any less horrific, but I think we're going to all have to find new ways of describing what the consequences of those conflicts are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the other thing is the marketplace, and the games industry is multi-million-dollar. It's not going to stop anytime soon. Lots of the young guys who are commanding the drones that James is referring to, they're doing that, then they're playing the game later on. So yeah, the disconnect with reality. And just back to one of the original points about storytelling is for us to understand the reality we are actually in through the art of storytelling, can inform our moral judgments. Sounding like an old fogey now, but I worry sometimes about some of the moral harm that's been done by certain computer games. It's a kind of form of indulgence which is just a wee bit too easy. And unfortunately, when that's combined with a lot of money being made, it's difficult to turn it around. And it's to the new generation to really approach that.
But I think also, and this is an area I don't really know that much about, but I mean, today's children are very much what we call digital native. And I think we see other kind of forms of warfare, and I would call it warfare, where, I mean, you've got the whole electrical network on the east coast of America was brought down by hacking. So I think, hacking is being, I mean, we've seen it in use in elections and things. And that's a very powerful tool. It's without doubt that countries around the world, whoever, Russia, America, Britain, whoever, are using it as a tool to disrupt and cause mayhem. And again, that is done from, an office, a room, a bunker somewhere that causes kind of untold misery, really, the kind of knock-on effects of things like that. That in itself will be really interesting to see how things like that are portrayed, whether it's combined with, physical warfare, missiles, drones, whatever. But I also, Alice, I want to go back to, you mentioned a book by Michael Foreman that came out in the 60s. And I've actually got beside me, I've got a book by Michael Foreman. I mean, he wrote, or he certainly illustrated a number of wonderful books. And this one is called The General, and it was written in 1961 by Janet Charters, a huge bombastic general in all his finery, but basically fell off his horse and he kind of ended up lying down in this field full of flowers and suddenly saw the world from a different perspective, and eventually kind of got together with his two other generals, and you could kind of just see images of Stalin and or whoever it was, Brezhnev or whatever at that time, them kind of deciding to change the world and make it a place of kind of beauty and peace. And this, of course, was, I mean, it says in the back of the book, at the height of the Cold War, a young couple produced a new kind of book for children, and it confronted the folly of war and the threat to the environment, which is so on kind of message now. I mean, the very fact that this book has been republished, we'll see more books like that coming out again, that kind of idea of promoting peace and seeing things from a more peaceful perspective, combined with helping the environment.
You've got me thinking also of quite a young children's book by David McGee, The Conquerors, which again looks very critically at these generals that are marching through everywhere, trying to conquer everything. And the children, they're not nose-led, it's not didactic in any way, but the children over the course of the book learn the absurdity of this all-conquering behavior. And similarly, there's a book by Nikolai Popov called Why, which is about a frog and a mouse and how a small argument turns into a full-scale war. And again, it's not didactic, but even very young children are kind of led to explore for themselves, you know, the absurdity of how some conflicts blow up. And I think it comes back to some of the things that you, James, and other people have said in the course of the conversation, that we shouldn't underestimate what children are able to take from books and the lessons that they're able to draw out themselves from looking very closely at the pictures and reading between the lines of the storytelling. So lots of really interesting things have come out of what all three of you have just said there. Jill, you mentioned cyber warfare as something of the future. Interestingly, my oldest daughter recently read a book about cyber warfare for sort of early teens, and I think she found it far more harrowing and disturbing and worrying. She actually wanted to hide the book. She didn't want it in her room, than, let's say, a book about a kind of more conventional kind of warfare that we've been used to and that we've been brought up on, in a sense. So that's an interesting place, I suppose, for children's publishing to go. And James and Jim, you both mentioned the distance of operating a drone from an office and it not looking like a battlefield. So in some ways, I suppose you might argue that the days of representing, you know, full-scale pitched battle might seem less relevant, except that image that we've been talking about in the second page of the sort of the 4-page spread of the Battle of Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce grits his teeth and puts an axe through someone's head, is precisely what we must keep looking at if we're to understand that that's the same as pressing a button and sending a drone missile, because that's what you're doing. It's equally violent. And so historical battles where people are actually face to face and hand to hand still, I suppose, have an important role to play. And Jim, you said, you know, you talked about the importance of storytelling, the power of storytelling to wrestle with these really big issues.
I mean, I was going to say, I mean, this is a book, we're talking about it today, and it's going out on a podcast. You know, I've had the huge kind of pleasure to have had the book selected by the British Council. And that, you know, Robert the Bruce was part of, you know, an exhibition that toured the world. And I went to places like Pakistan and Sri Lanka with it, you know, and I was literally being ferried around there by, you know, armoured vehicle, and everything was being searched for car bombs and things. But in the end, you meet the most wonderful children and families, and you know, you're showing them this book and showing them the illustrations, and it generates discussion. And that was fascinating to me, you know, that a story from 14th century Scotland could resonate in Pakistan, in a small town, you know. So yes, the book has had legs, and it's a story that's not going to go away. And you know, I think it's proved very popular. So, and I'm delighted about that. I'm very proud of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's great to hear from Jim that the book is still in print. But I think it's also a reminder that the physical book is an amazingly good piece of kit. And you know, I've got books on my shelves here that are 100, 200 years old. They're still, you just take them off the shelf and there they are. You open them up and they work. And they'll probably books will outlive most of the technology that's creating the video games at the moment. And I think it's really important to remember that 50 or 100 years from now, some young reader can take this book off a shelf somewhere and read it, and it will still work in exactly the same way as it does today.
That's a very good point, yeah.
Yeah. Books have a lasting power, and the stories in them have a lasting power. As you say, this is a story from 700 years ago that's still sparking discussion between children and their parents, between children and teachers, in many, many countries around the world. And so the book that you've put together as a team really has had a huge impact and will continue to have a huge impact. Just a reminder to listeners that you can buy it, Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, by James Robertson, illustrated by Jill Calder and published by Berlin Books. Available from any good bookseller still. Jill, James and Jim, you've given us so much to think about today. Thank you very much for sparing the time to be with me. We've talked about children's literature and the way in which it represents war in all sorts of ways, the powerful impact of visuals as well as storytelling, the role that historical stories have to play even today, even in the world of cyber warfare and drone warfare, perhaps arguably just as important a role to play, given how rapidly war itself and conflict is evolving. So thank you very much for sparing the time and being with me. And thank you also to our listeners for joining us again. I hope that you found this conversation with Jill, Jim and James just as fascinating as I have. Do keep tuning into the Visualising War podcast. We have another fascinating episode coming up next week. We're going to be sticking with literature, but turning to the magazine publishing world, talking to the editors of Ancient Warfare magazine. So do tune in for that. If you'd like to support our project, please share and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. And please do leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcast. It really helps people find the show. And if you'd like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualising War, or get in touch directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zofia Gertin. Thanks very much for listening.